If you enjoy my work, please consider supporting me on my Patreon or on my Buy Me a Coffee page. The links to both websites are in the description of this video. One of my channel's central themes is the demographic fate of regions with deeply subreplacement fertility. In the past, I have made videos about the possible future increase in fertility rates of the long-term subreplacement fertility regions, mainly Europe, due to the persistent fertility advantage of practicing Christians and due to the potential coming collapse of public pension systems, resulting in the reinvented role of children as a form of an old age insurance. I have thus explored possible increases in fertility caused by sociocultural and socioeconomic changes. In this video, I would like to explore the last, but certainly not the least, way in which the fertility rates could increase significantly in the future, and that is the natural selection and overall genetic pressure working in favor of higher fertility. Many of my viewers have suggested this option in the comments, and I have also contemplated it many times. Still, I was hesitant, since genetics is significantly more of a hard science in comparison with the conventional demographic theories that are overwhelmingly studied within the limits of social sciences. That means that the vast majority of conventional literature dealing with demographics that I have studied, as well as the widespreadly accepted theories like the demographic transition, are mostly outlined without any regard given to the possible genetic influences on the subject. Even though, after doing my fair share of research on the subject, it is quite clear that the sociocultural and the genetic aspects of fertility are inseparable and should always be considered together. To clarify for viewers that do not follow my channel regularly, the demographic transition is a phenomenon and theory which refers to the historical shift from high birth rates and high death rates in societies with minimal technology, education, especially of women, and economic development, to low birth rates and low death rates in societies with advanced technology, education, and economic development, as well as the stages between these two scenarios. However, the basic assumption of the natural selection fertility increase hypothesis is relatively simple. If there are some aspects of human reproductive behavior leading to higher fertility that are genetic in their nature and intergenerationally heritable, the higher fertility of people possessing these traits in comparison with people lacking them should, over generations, lead to the spread of these traits throughout the population via higher childbearing and thus higher overall fertility of the whole populations. While this hypothesis seems logical at first sight, just by simple gloss over the reproductive behavior of many populations throughout the world in the last century, it is visible that the matter is not so straightforward. If it was, fertility should have never declined to subreplacement levels and would have been very stable throughout history. The literature on this subject is relatively limited, since it has only gained traction within the scientific community in the past couple of decades. I thus had no other option than to roll up my sleeves and deep dive into the number of scientific research papers dealing with the link between fertility and genetics. The research papers I studied deal primarily with the populations of European heritage in European countries, since Europe is the continent where I live and the continent that entered the demographic transition first and is thus the ripest in terms of the study of genetic variants of fertility. I have to admit, this was likely the most challenging video for me to make, since it is out of my usual scope of research, but I learned many new things and, who said it is supposed to be easy, right? I hope I have tackled this complex and fascinating subject with dignity. So, will the demographic fortunes of aging and declining nations be reversed due to the newly emerging birth cohorts of baby-making machines genetically predisposed to having massive families? Let's find out. The basic question we need to ask is, are the traits connected with fertility genetically heritable? And if yes, to what extent? The short answer is yes, but the extent to which they are heritable and how stable this heritability is in time remain a matter of ongoing scientific debate. Heritability is defined as the proportion of the phenotypic variation attributed to genes. To quote one of the studies I researched for this video, natural selection tends to eliminate genetic variation in traits linked to reproductive success, with that elimination more rapid the stronger the link. Those traits associated with higher fertility outcompete traits associated with lower fertility, eliminating the low fertility traits from the population and leaving the high fertility trait at fixation. As a result, it might be expected that the heritability of fertility would be low or zero, with all of the population sharing the same fertility-related traits. For pre-20th century populations that had not undergone a demographic transition, this appears to be the case. However, changes in the environment can change the way in which genetically based variation in traits may affect fitness. In the case of fertility, any of the environmental changes caused by the demographic transition, such as changed preference for the quantity of children or increased effectiveness of contraceptive devices, could have increased the heritability of fertility. People with different genetic variants respond to these environmental changes in different ways, leading to that genetic variation affecting fertility outcomes. In considering how these environmental changes affect heritability, fertility might be thought of as a composite of subtraits that affects the number of offsprings. These subtraits might include the preference for children, personality traits such as conscientiousness, ability to accrue resources to attract mates, and physiological factors. In countries that have undergone the demographic transition, twin, adoption, and family studies have pointed to a substantial genetic effect on fertility. That implies that in the pre-industrial populations of Europe and other regions, the genetic variance responsible for fertility was severely limited, possibly nearly non-existent, with the universal prevalence of high fertility traits. However, the technological innovations and subsequent changes in socio-cultural as well as physical environment that culminated in the Industrial Revolution and the demographic transition were so massive that they managed to override the underlying genetic forces in play, and fertility started to decline massively. This decline, in combination with the significant rise of personal preference as a crucial factor determining fertility, means that the differences in genetic variants of traits related to fertility once again started to play a significant role. One has to understand the fertility behavior of different populations as a constant interplay between the genetic ability and inclination to reproduce, societal environment, and personal choices, which are, nevertheless, also genetically predisposed to a certain extent. It is possible for genetic preference for smaller families to be overridden by overall societal consensus expecting large families, for example, among Amish, Haredi Jewish, or conservative Muslim communities. And the genetic preferences of large families can be overridden by the opposite sociocultural preferences, as is often the case in contemporary developed societies. But while the socio-cultural pressure making large families standard limits the selection for high fertility traits, since the societal norms diminish the importance of personal preference, the opposite is true in the low fertility social environment. The higher the role of a personal inclination and preference in fertility is, the more significant the heritability should be. The estimates of the current heritability of traits connected to fertility in developed countries usually fluctuate around 0.1 to 0.3, meaning that genetic factors might decide between 10 and 30% of the reproductive behavior. Now, as was already said, there is not some single magical fertility gene that would by itself make people have large families, but many different genetic signals that substantially associate with either higher or lower fertility. Scientists additionally follow the connection between the genetic architecture supporting higher or lower numbers of children and the different heritable traits associated with them, the most significant being probably the age at first birth. Number of children ever born and the age at first birth significantly negatively correlate with each other, which is quite logical. On average, if a woman has her first child earlier, she will likely have more during her lifetime than if she would have it later. So, if some heritable trait influences one of these two categories, it influences both via their correlation. Some studies calculated that the heritability of the number of children ever born at the age at first birth is close to 50%, with the genetic component of this heritability being 15% for the age at first birth and 10% for the number of children. That means that while half of people perpetuate the reproductive behavior of their parents, the majority of this heritability is caused by non-genetic factors. If you grew up in a large family, you are more likely also to want a large family, not just because of genes, but also because of your childhood experience influencing your life aspirations and expectations. The specific traits that influence fertility can be either psychological, meaning that they influence the inclination of a person towards having a family, or biological, meaning that they influence the biological ability to have children. Studies trying to decide which of these two aspects, psychology or biology, has more effect, found that biological traits are significantly more important than psychological ones. That was determined by the comparison of influence on reproductive behavior and its outcomes of the age of attempt to have a first child, which represents the psychological inclination, and the time lag between this attempt and giving birth, representing the biological ability to have a child. It makes sense that biological influences are the more decisive ones. I would compare it to geography's influence on the different nations' development. While the Czech Republic would maybe love to be a naval power with all the benefits of being one, it is just borderline impossible while being a landlocked country. And while a woman or a couple would maybe love to have a large family with 3 or 4 children, it might be impossible without the biological ability to get pregnant, or very unlikely if every pregnancy is a result of years of trying or even spending significant financial resources on medical help, which is fairly common. On the other hand, a woman that might not really plan to have a large family, but gets pregnant every time she and her partner have some action, might end up with a larger family than a biologically less fertile woman with significant pro-family psychological inclinations. As for the specific traits that are positively correlated with the age at first birth, meaning the higher position of the trait on average means higher age at first birth, the most important ones are the age of the first menstrual period in female adolescent, age at menopause, birth weight, age at first sexual intercourse, and years of education. But we must remember that higher age at first birth correlates with the number of children negatively. So higher possession of these traits translates into fewer children. On the other hand, phenotypes that correlated with lower age at first birth and thus a higher average number of children include a higher genetic risk of smoking, higher body mass index, higher risk of diabetes, higher waist to hip ratio, triglyceride levels, or fasting insulin. There is a certain paradox in play here, since the traits connected to higher reproductive success, which is commonly taken as a sign of evolutionary fitness, are mostly those associated with higher disease risk, which reduces evolutionary fitness. As for the signals positively associated with the number of children, apart from those connected to earlier age at first birth, there is a positive association with lower testosterone concentrations in women, higher testosterone concentrations in men, higher circulating sex hormone binding globulin, a higher propensity for risk-taking behavior, and a lower likelihood of same-sex sexual behavior. Other signals are associated with increased numbers of children but shorter reproductive lifespans, so a later age of the first menstrual period and earlier menopause, which implies a certain trade-off between the intensity and longevity of reproduction. It needs to be said that many of these traits, for example, the age at first birth or testosterone levels, are obviously sex-specific, but many also apply to both sexes. The number of offsprings surviving to reach a reproductive age is an essential aspect of fitness and should thus be selected for by natural selection. Researchers found out in a Danish population sample that those from larger families contribute disproportionately to the next generation and the number of more distant kin. In that case, 8.8% of those with 4 or more siblings born in the 1968-1969 cohort were responsible for 15.1% of births to this cohort in the end of 1994. Since the heritability of genetic makeup connected to the age at first birth and the number of children has been established, the consequence of this is the fact that natural selection is an active force in modern, industrialized societies, implying that women born in more recent cohorts may be genetically inclined to have an earlier age at first birth and more children. This fact is, however, somewhat of a population paradox, because it strongly contradicts observed fertility trends over the last 50 years. Instead, there has been a massive postponement in the age at first birth of an average of 4 to 5 years in nearly all European countries and the US since the 1970s. Natural selection works in addition to environmental forces and in the opposite direction, with the latter being stronger. Natural fertility populations are assumed to have set fertility norms to maximize reproductive success. With the absence of contraception, the full reproductive potential can be expressed. In European and many other industrialized societies, in contrast, environmental changes across the past century, such as the use of contraceptives and women's educational expansion and entry into the labor market, have had a strong impact on fertility behavior. This has led to a postponement in the age at first birth, even though more recent populations are genetically predisposed to an earlier birth age. In that sense, the environment has achieved an evolutionary override. The young Western feminist saying that she does not want to have children due to motherhood being an oppressive patriarchal structure or some other nonsense like that might actually be more genetically predisposed to having a large family than her grandmother with 6 children. The discrepancy between observed changes and those predicted by evolutionary processes shows parallels to the case of human height. Although natural selection has a disinclination for taller individuals, at least in the US populations, people still, on average, grow up to be taller than their parents. That is also largely contributed to environmental factors, such as better nutrition and improved healthcare. We can find countless similar examples. Since higher testosterone levels and subsequent sperm quantities among men are connected to higher numbers of children and thus should be selected for in developed countries, the testosterone levels and sperm counts among Western men are declining, since the environmental and social factors, such as hormones in the water or obesity, are overriding the natural selection. However, natural selection may also work in tandem with environmental factors. A recent study suggests that, in the Netherlands, natural selection favored taller heights and thus reinforced the effects of improved environmental quality over the last 150 years. Different studies tried to apply the findings connected to the heritability of fertility to population projections. These projections cannot, however, be taken as a scientific calculations of future fertility based on genetics, since, as we have established, genetics can be and currently are overridden by non-genetic social factors. It is, however, a useful tool to imagine how fertility could look in the future if genetic factors prevailed, possibly being supported by changed societal models supporting a higher fertility, which might happen. There are several key takeaways from these projections. First, the worldwide fertility decrease projected by most demographers would be significantly less pronounced if the heritability of fertility prevailed. Specifically, the median projection of the global total fertility rate declines from 2.5 children per woman in 2015 to 2.2 children per woman in 2100. However, without the heritability included, the world fertility is projected to be 1.8 children per woman in 2100. This result is largely driven by increases in fertility in continents with populations that have completed the demographic transition. For example, the European median total fertility rate increases from 1.8 to 2.46 children per woman in the heritability model, and North American fertility increases from 1.85 to 2.7 children per woman. That suggests a European population of around 800 million at the end of the century, near its current level, compared to a conventional model forecast of 660 million in 2100. North America's population also sees an increased rate of growth, with a population estimated to be 150 million higher than in the conventional model at the end of this century, at 650 million. In contrast, Africa's fertility and population remain unchanged under both models, since most of Africa has not completed its demographic transition, and the selection thus should not apply. African fertility is thus projected to decline from the current level of under 4 children per woman to levels over 2 children per woman in both models. In Asia, there is an increase in the projected fertility from 1.7 children per woman to 2.2 children per woman under the heritability model. However, Asia is an extremely demographically heterogeneous region, and it is implied that if it were divided into subregions, the increase would be highest in East Asian countries with ultra-low fertility, high childlessness, and thus a large space for natural selection to apply. The projections of future heritability levels also impact the old age population support ratio, which is the ratio of working age people to those above 65 years. Noticeably, despite the rise in fertility, it is still predicted to decline substantially. The support ratio, meaning the number of working age people per one retiree, would decrease from 3.5 to 2 in the heritability model, rather than to 1.7 in the conventional model in Europe, and from 4 to 2.2 rather than to 1.8 in North America. Moreover, once the increase in the number of children is considered, the higher number of children in the heritability model merely shifts the nature of the burden from old people to children. Including those under 15 years in the population support ratio, the ratio declines to 1 in Europe, down from the current 1.6. Similarly, the population support ratio in North America declines from 1.5 in 2015 to 1 in 2100 under the heritability model. However, it is important to note that the supported children are completely different in long-term effects than old people, since they grow up to be workers and have children themselves. In contrast, old people are, to be frank, just a burden in this regard. But I must again repeat that we need to be conscious of the numerous limitations of these models. While the increase in European fertility sounds great, and one would love to believe it to be true, apart from the already mentioned triumph of external non-genetic factors over genetics in the contemporary developed populations, another major setback stems from the fact that genes associated with fertility outcomes are not the same across geographical and historical environments. By not considering this, previous genetic studies implicitly assumed that the genetic effects are constant across time and space. Across all individuals and environments, common genetic traits explained only 4% of the variance in fertility outcomes. On the opposite, for individuals from the same population and demographic cohorts born before or after the 20th century fertility decline, heritability was almost 5 times higher at around 20%. No evidence suggesting that genetic effects on fertility are shared across time and space was found. On the contrary, findings imply that the environment strongly modifies genetic effects on the tempo and quantum of fertility, and that currently ongoing natural selection is heterogeneous across environments. Basically, different populations in the different countries, even European ones, might have very different characteristics connected to the heritability of fertility. Most of these studies conducted on the subject and used in this video stem from northwestern native European populations, mostly from UK, the Netherlands, Denmark, France and such. A smaller number was using pan-European populations. Applying these studies' results to other countries is likely not scientifically correct. So, will natural selection increase the future fertility of currently aging societies in Europe and elsewhere? It might, but it is far from certain, and it very likely won't happen by itself. The overall societal atmosphere regarding having children, as well as biological factors, are crucial, since they can powerfully override genetic inclinations. Thus, it would be a mistake to perceive this matter mechanically and just wait for the Darwinian forces to raise fertility regardless of the overall societal climate. People are not slaves of their genes, even though genes significantly influence our behavior and lives. Even if you are genetically predisposed to wanting a large family and many children, you might be limited by the biological infertility of you or your partner. Or, even if you are very biologically fertile and want a large family, your reproductive aspirations might be limited by your economic situation, culture or climate supporting small families, or other ambitions in life, for example, your career. If I learned anything when researching this video, it is the fact that genetics is not an omnipotent force silently and mercilessly moving history forward, while we, humans, are a mere pawns on the grand chessboard of Darwinian processes. And this applies not just to fertility, but probably to many other genetic areas influencing human life as well. I'm honestly glad these are the results I have found, since the opposite would be, in a way, profoundly depressing and discouraging. What would be the point of rigorous studies of demographics if it will all be decided on the cold, impersonal genetic level anyway? On the other hand, one also has to wonder if the current subreplacement fertility levels as a manifestation of the victory of external forces over the natural selection are sustainable, and if natural selection won't find a way to balance it somehow out and bring fertility to more sustainable levels in the long run. In the end, reproductive success is one of the crucial aspects of fitness that natural selection should pressure for. The process of demographic transition is still a puzzle for evolutionary biologists, since it seems to go against the commonly accepted trend of organisms maximizing opportunities for reproduction. Under natural selection, you would expect organisms to use their resources to produce more genetic descendants and to increase their Darwinian fitness. Studies confirm that having a small number of children increases descendants' social and economic success across up to 4 generations, but reduces the total number of long-term descendants. So, there appears to be a trade-off between the economic well-being of one's offspring and their long-term reproductive success. Overall, the subject is so incredibly complex that any simple and clear-cut results are very likely incorrect. The precise mix of the genetic and social influences on human behavior is so interconnected and interdependent on so many levels that it might be borderline impossible to demarcate the two phenomena precisely. The precise ratio of genetic, social, and purely coincidental factors might also constantly change. If the implicit antinatalism of current culture or biological factors massively diminishing the biological fertility of the populations continues, natural selection will very likely be powerless, or will be just a minor correction of these trends. However, if the societal headwinds change and more family-oriented cultural patterns start to apply, possibly due to some of the reasons outlined in my previous videos, like the religious renaissance or reinvented role of children as an old age insurance, the powerful genetic undercurrents might kick in, and we might see a robust increase in fertility in sync with the models outlined in the previous chapter. So, those of us who care about the demographics of our nations and do not want to see them age and decline into obsolescence and irrelevance should continue to try to propagate more pronatalist approaches, both by example and in the public debate. If we succeed, we might have an unexpected and a powerful ally in genetics.